Hi there, and welcome to another episode of the Future of Jewish podcast. I'm your host, Joshua Hoffman. On this episode, I am joined by Rabbi Scott Kahn. He is the director of Jewish Coffee House and the host of several podcasts, including Orthodox Conundrum, Intimate Judaism, and Baseball Rabbi. Enjoy my conversation with Rabbi Scott Kahn. Scott, thank you so much for taking the time to speak to me today. Why don't you give us a little background, who you are, where you came from, all the good stuff that led to what you're doing today?
Okay, well, it's nice to be here, Joshua. I'm originally from Boston. I made Aliyah about 26 or so years ago, a little more than that. So as a Boston kid, I grew up going to Maimonides, the Orthodox Jewish high school over there. After I went to Maimonides, just giving you a quick background over here, I went to Yeshiva in Israel. I went to Brandeis University, came back to Israel, went to graduate school, came back to Israel, et cetera, et cetera. And I've been here. I'm married with 7 children, living in Ramat Beit Shemesh and really enjoying life here in Israel. I used to run a yeshiva. I co-started a yeshiva with my friend, Rabbi Pesach Wilicki, called Yisodei Torah. We had 11 good years. And unfortunately, then the yeshiva, which was for post-high school students, closed. And since then, I've been working in podcasting and Jewish media. And specifically, what I did was I started a company called Jewish Coffee House, which is an online media purveyor, content creator. And the primary thing that we do is we create podcasts. And the 2 podcasts which I am most involved in right now in my own personal podcasting journey are Orthodox Conundrum, which deals with issues in the Orthodox world, good and bad, although trying to do what we can in order to make the Orthodox world as good as it should be based on its own principles and how good it can be based on what I think it should be. And also Intimate Judaism is about, I co-host that with Tali Rosenbaum. That is a podcast which deals with intimacy, sex, Judaism, and how halacha and Jewish hashkafa, Jewish thought, intersect with a therapeutic view toward sexuality and intimacy. So that's basically the background right there.
So before we get into Jewish Coffee House and some of these podcasts, which sound incredibly interesting, I want to actually pick your brain a little bit about the yeshiva. And, yeshivas, especially in sort of my secular world, get a bad rap, as I'm sure you know. Talk to us a little bit about some of the most common misconceptions about yeshivot and running one.
Well, if you don't mind, Joshua, can I throw back at you when you say they get a bad rap? So what are you referring to? Because I know that there are certain problems that I see in yeshivot, and there's certain great things about yeshivot. So I'm curious, what sorts of things have you heard? And maybe then I can respond to those specific ideas and give you my impression, because there's so many different ways I could take this question. It's such an interesting way of asking.
So I think what's interesting about your question back to me is that I don't know if there's necessarily misconceptions about the yeshivot themselves, but I feel that because the yeshivot are part of the greater Orthodox world, and maybe the Orthodox world isn't so kindly looked upon sometimes by the non-Orthodox Jewish world, let alone non-Jews themselves. It seems to me that because the yeshiva is such a central part of the Orthodox world, that's where I think it comes from. So specifically with yeshivot, I maybe there might not be, there might be issues around gender and stuff like that, but obviously that's a microcosm for the greater Orthodox world. I'm just curious, what are some of the things that you would like more people to know about yeshivot that maybe are not as talked about?
That's a really interesting question. I mean, as you said, as you implied, there are some things about yeshiva which are really wonderful and some things about them which have their problems, but every yeshiva is different. There's no one thing called the yeshiva or the yeshiva world, even though people colloquially will discuss it in those terms. There also are yeshivot in many different communities. We're talking about yeshivot in the ultra-Orthodox community. There's the Dati Lumi, the religious community, and the national religious community. There are conservative reform yeshivot. So it's hard to even define them in general. I think that yeshivot, when they're at their best, and this is how I'd answer the question, yeshivot, when they're really doing what they're doing at their best, are solid educational institutions. And yes, they do exist. These are solid educational institutions that are there in order to certainly teach Torah, to try and teach our classic Jewish sources, but at the same time are also there to imbibe and to allow us to imbibe, to impart a real sense of spirituality, a sense of God-centeredness into our lives. Because in Judaism, learning Torah is not just an academic exercise, and it's not simply a means of learning how to do the things that Jewish law requires us to do. Learning Torah, when it's done right, is a religious act in its own. It's actually in some ways considered one of the highest or greatest religious acts. It's an opportunity to interface with God himself. So when yeshivot are at their best, that is put at the front and center. And even though it may not be discussed actively, that's underpinning everything that's done. And so therefore, yeshiva that's really good is a place of spirituality. Yeshiva is a place where people who are there are involved in meeting the divine. So I think that's a very important point. It's not just a matter of people studying stuff. Yeah, that's there, but that's the surface. What's really happening is a meeting between man and God. But that's only one aspect of it, because also at the same time, a yeshiva is supposed to help us make our behavior better. If a person studies purely on a logical, theoretical level, but it doesn't impact his behavior in a very real way, then yeshiva is failing, because learning Torah has to affect the way a person acts in his daily life. So again, if yeshiva is done right, and there are many that do it right, the people who come out of there come out as more refined individuals, as more moral people, as more ethical people, as more religiously dedicated people, as people who have a greater commitment to Jewish law, to halacha. So in its ultimate sense, that's what I would like yeshivot to be, and that's what many yeshivot are. And when yeshivot are done right, that's the result. That's how I would say, that's how I would present it to an audience asking, what is yeshiva all about? It's about that interface with God. It's about this idea of perfecting ourselves as much as possible to make us the best people that we can be. Does that always happen? Certainly not, and that's part of the problem. But at least in principle, that's what yeshiva is supposed to be.
So let's talk about God for a second, because a lot of Jews don't believe in God, aren't sure if there's a God, maybe do casually believe in God, but don't live their life accordingly in such a strict paradigm, if you will. So are you effectively saying that if you don't believe in God, or if you don't have a significant relationship with him or her, that yeshiva therefore is not for you?
That's a really good question. I would not say that. I would say that yeshiva isn't only predicated on the assumption that there is a God. A yeshiva is also a roadmap in order to have that experience of God. That doesn't mean that everybody's necessarily going to get it, because it doesn't work that way. It's not as simple as that. But in some ways, the belief in God is the base of the entire pyramid on which this system is based. But in a different perspective, it's the apex. It's the goal to which we're reaching. That someone might say, I want to go to yeshiva because I don't believe in God. I don't have a relationship with God, but I'd like to. If a person has already ruled out God in his life or her life, I'm not sure what the right thing to do in that situation would be vis-a-vis yeshiva. It could be, it would still have that effect. But certainly if somebody says, I don't believe in God, but I'd like to have that interface, I'd like to give it a shot, I'd like to see what would happen. Once again, there are no guarantees. The interaction with God is not something which is a mathematical formula that if you do the following things, that recipe will guarantee you the following interaction. But if a person's truly open to that experience and says, I'm going to work with the assumption, the predicate that God is present in these words that I'm reading, and I'm going to learn it accordingly, not to something which is simply academic, but something which is a vehicle towards interacting with the divine, then yeshiva can be a means for the person to get that belief in God, to strengthen his or her belief in God, to enable them to have that interaction. So I wouldn't say that if somebody doesn't believe in God, but would like to have that experience, or has what he or she might call a weak belief in God, the yeshiva is not for them. On the contrary, I'd actually say, no, that's probably someone who could really use yeshiva. That'll be great for that person.
Definitely. Talk to me a little bit about the areas that you think some of the yeshiva, in your experience, like I know you can't speak for all of them, but in your experience and the way that you see it, some of the ways that they should be improved.
Certainly. I think that yeshivot often are staffed with people who became teachers because they enjoy learning, or because they're very good at learning Torah, but that doesn't mean they necessarily have any educational training. Now, there can be wonderful teachers who don't have educational training. I don't want to pretend that educational training is the most important thing in the world, but at the same time, being a teacher is a profession. It's not simply you do when, well, I learn well, so I guess I'll be a teacher. That is a wrong reason to get into teaching. And I think too often yeshivot take the best learners, the people who are really strong at learning, and those people become the heads of the yeshivot, or the teachers in the yeshivot, the rabbis there. And educationally, that may not be particularly sound. So often you have people who are teaching, but then, well, they'll call it teaching. I'll put teaching in quotes. But what's actually happening is they're simply learning out loud. So you might have some wonderful teachers. You might have some very, very terrible teachers over there. Now, in a more negative sense, sometimes I think one of the problems yeshivot have, there are so many different types of yeshivot, so it's hard for me to point and say it's any given kind, because I think this probably is endemic in all situations. I mean, yeshivot don't have this problem, but one problem that many have is charismatic leadership. Now, charismatic leadership sounds good. It might be nice to have someone with a lot of charisma, but part of the problem is that when you combine charismatic leadership without an actual educational methodology, sometimes that can lead towards cult-like behavior when people will fall blindly and they won't necessarily be thinking for themselves at times. I think there's a problem when sometimes rabbis are treated like, I mean, they are authority figures in the sense that they are sources of Jewish law. They explain what the law is. But when it goes beyond that and they're treated almost like a divine oracle, at times that can happen and it's very dangerous. And it's something which is a big problem. Too often we see rabbis treated like they are what used to be called in Jewish literature, the Urim V'Tumim, the breastplate on the high priest's chest, which would enable people to have a type of prophecy. They would tell people what to do and what not to do. Well, that's in the Bible, but what a human being can do that nowadays without any assistance from God himself, the Urim V'Tumim, and as far as I know, no one has that, I think that we're in real trouble. So I don't like that charismatic leadership. I think charismatic leadership in general is dangerous. And I don't have to elaborate on reasons why. I'm sure your listeners know the dangers that we've seen when we just recently have the whole Chaim Walder situation in the Orthodox world, and other people as well. Meshi Zahav just died. People like that have a type of charismatic leadership, and that charismatic leadership enables them to do things that are not appropriate. I am not in any way, God forbid, saying that all these charismatic leadership, or most of them, or anything like that, are doing anything that's untoward, but it's just a dangerous form of leadership that can lead to problems when it's taken in extremis.
It's an interesting thought because, I was just writing an essay recently, just finished it today, probably will go up next week, but it's about why Jews, who are ordinarily good people, just like most human beings, why we can't seem to agree oftentimes on politics and religion. And one of the things is how we look at the world, right? If you look at more left-leaning folks or more liberal folks, which tend to be less religious, less God-leaning, they're more about the individual. And if you look at more right-leaning folks, which are more conservative, maybe more religious in some cases, they tend to be more communal. It's not about what's best for the individual. It's what's best for the community, for the group. Now, that's a generalization, of course. It seems to me, though, that when you talk about charismatic leadership, because that puts a spotlight on a individual, that can create a conflict, because now the individual seems to rise above the group. And I'm wondering if that rings a bell at all and some of the things that you've seen.
I mean, it's interesting. You make that interesting distinction between left-leaning versus right-leaning being more individualistic versus in the right-leaning being more community-driven. And I'd have to think about that because, frankly, my natural inclination would actually be going the opposite direction. It could be my American background. But when you think of people on the left, like what you might call the Progressive Democratic Party, it believes that the government should be much more involved in people's individual lives. The community as such, meaning the community of the state, should be helping people. The government has to give money out to enable people to fulfill everything they need to fulfill. That's definitely more communitarian, whereas the right wing, at least in principle, we're talking about maybe right-wing republicanism, is much more about the individual. We're not going to believe in handouts. You have to do it yourself, anti-welfare, etc. Because no, the individual has to run it. So I know that these terms left and right are, I'm not going to say they're so much malleable as they mean different things in different contexts, but it's just interesting that you put it that way, because I'm sure that's true in certain contexts. My natural inclination is to say the opposite, that when you're dealing with people who are more right-wing, they're more individualized. Now, at the same time, I think very often, getting back to what you were saying, in a communitarian situation or scenario, even though that might be theoretically about the community, almost always somebody rises to the top. I mean, to put it in negative terms, if you want to put it in negative terms, if you think about, communist countries, which I'm not pro-communist countries. I'm saying in these places where it's very much about the community, everything is, there isn't really officially even a state. There's just the Communist Party, which is all of us, but there's always a dictator at the top. It always ends up that one person sort of becomes that person. I'm not a political theorist, but I'm not sure that in real life, it always happens that in places that are based on the community, you really have a community that doesn't end up having one person or a group of people who become the leadership ultimately. George Orwell's Animal Farm is all about how that's what happens, that very dangerous process. So look, in the same way, if we talk about a religious area, even if we think about it as individualistic, I think that certainly in Judaism, there is an individualistic streak along with a community streak. Tefillah, for example, prayer is ideally done with a minyan, with a group of 10 people. It's supposed to be 10 people davening together. And by praying together in a group, that is a a better form of prayer service than doing individually. At the same time, the height of prayer, which is the Shemona Esrei, the Amidah, the silent meditation, is done quietly, each person individually, and he or she will say his or her own private prayers in that time. There's this sort of balance between the community and the individual. In fact, Rav Soloveitchik wrote, Rabbi B. Soloveitchik, the great Orthodox leader in the United States, who died in 1993. In 1978, he published an essay in Tradition, in Tradition magazine. I apologize, I'm just getting over COVID. He published something in Tradition magazine called The Community. It was one of 5 essays in that issue that he wrote. And the community discusses this exact issue. Who is paramount in Judaism? Is it the individual or is it the community? Or in different terms, does the individual have all the rights and gives them up to the community? Or initially, does the community have all the rights and then imparts them to the individual, which is the direction in which it goes? And Rav Soloveitchik, as is his wont, says it's neither, it's both. Both of them have a place in Judaism. There's not one or the other. We believe in both. The individual has a place and the community as a whole has a place. And I think that much of Judaism will show that rings true. There really are aspects of both.
I want to go to your comment about Orthodox world problems and what the Orthodox world should be. And I'm just curious if you could elaborate on some of those thoughts.
Sure. I'll start off by saying that the reason that I care about it is that because I'm Orthodox myself, I'm proudly Orthodox. I am a Torah-believing Jew, and I see the ideals in Torah. I don't put myself up to be a massive scholar who should tell everybody else what they should do. At the same time, I think it's clear to me and to many, many others that some of the ideals that Torah presents, which are fantastic and wonderful ideals, are often not met by the Orthodox community as such. And we need to try and make that Orthodox community, whichever Orthodox community we're part of, the larger worldwide Orthodox community or our own individual neighborhoods, we need to try to make those communities live up to those ideals. I mentioned one before, the whole Chaim Walder situation. And I think in some ways the Orthodox community is getting better about this, but certain segments of the Orthodox community are very, very reluctant to acknowledge that there is problems of sexual abuse. I don't say there's more sexual abuse in the Orthodox community than elsewhere. I don't know. I'm not a sociologist. But part of the problem is that because for a long time it wouldn't be spoken about, maybe for good reasons. It wouldn't be spoken about because of a misguided desire to be modest. We don't want to talk about such things. We don't want people to hear about them because it's not sanua. It's not something which upholds the ideals of modesty. So it was coming from an authentic values-based place. At the same time, by not talking about it, it allowed people to get away with it, which is really not good at all. And certainly it's not worth the silence. There's also perhaps a less admirable aspect to that silence, which is we don't want people to think badly about the Orthodox community. Now, on the one hand, that's okay because you want to say we have a good community. We don't want to say bad words about it. I understand that. But when things are bad and you hide it, and therefore there are victims who can't speak because we're afraid of what everyone will think about the Orthodox community, that's an example where it really needs to be cleaned up. So sexual abuse has been a problem in the Orthodox community, as it's been in probably most communities. And part of the problem is the silence that surrounds it and the inability for the Orthodox community often to talk about it openly. I hope and think it's getting better in certain parts of the community, but let's even mention right now. Yesterday, Yehuda Meshi Zahav, who was the founder of Zaka, which is an organization, a great organization as best I know, which would go to terrorist attacks and pick up body parts and for proper Jewish burial. It was a heroic organization in many ways. And the person who founded this was a very, very right-leaning Orthodox Jew who later on made peace with the Israeli state and became much more involved in Jewish life outside of his insular community. And he was held up until about a year or two ago as really a model of coexistence and someone who was one of the great heroes of Israel. I believe on Yom HaAtzmaut, on Israel Independence Day, he was even asked to light one of the torches that they put up there because he was symbolic of what we want many people to become, an Orthodox Jew in the ultra-Haredi sector of society who later on allowed himself to have full respect for all Jews. Well, unfortunately, it came out that he had been raping people for a long time and had been involved in many forms of sexual abuse. That's terrible. And then soon after it was revealed, before, I don't know if the statute of limitations had passed, if people had brought charges, I don't know, but it's quite clear that it was true. He attempted suicide and had been in a coma for the past year and died, I think, 2 days ago. Now, 2 days ago, when he died, or yesterday, right afterwards, in one of the local Orthodox online news sources called B'Chadrei Charedim, in the rooms of the Charedim, they had an obituary for him where it put the honorific Zal, Zichrono Livracha, may his memory be blessed, after his name. And they wrote about his life. And they said absolutely nothing about the sexual abuse. And the only thing they said was a small hint at the end. It said, if I recall, I'm translating from the Hebrew, after a media storm, he resigned his position as the head of this organization. And that was it. After a media storm, as if it were all made up, they wouldn't even say what it was about. So, I mean, this is terrible. The fact that he gets an obituary at all, fine. If you want to say, and he did some terrible things, this person was a rapist, and he was never brought to court because he effectively put himself out of commission before that could happen. If they had said that, fine. But to basically treat him like a hero of Israel with the honorific, may his memory be blessed, after his name, and saying nothing of substance about what happened, this is part of the conspiracy of silence that exists in the Orthodox world. That's an example of something that has to change. In the religious Zionist world, and certainly in the modern Orthodox world, I am quite sure this would not have happened. Unfortunately, in the Haredi world, there's still this inability to confront. And you can't just say, oh, but they don't, this value I mentioned before of modesty. Fine. If that really is your value, and I disagree with that strongly in this case, don't say anything. But to put up a glowing, or at least minimally a somewhat laudatory obituary of somebody who is a criminal, and in a very serious way with real victims who are in pain, what are you doing to the victims? There's no thought about how this is going to affect those victims, or if there is thought, that's even worse. It's very, very upsetting. So that's a good example of a problem that exists in the Orthodox community. There's certainly others, but that comes to mind just because of the news yesterday.
Interesting. You know, you gave a very extreme example, so I don't necessarily want to pick apart that example, but I do find that, you know, we all have baggage and we all do things. Some of us break the law, some of us break the moral law, the unwritten law. Actually, all of us do in some ways,
Yes.
right? I mean, no one's perfect.
No one's perfect.
And obviously, when you talk about rape and allegations of those kind, I mean, that's a much higher level. And like I said, I want to put that aside because that's kind of an extreme example. But, you know, I think that one of the things that I'm learning is, you know, humans are very judgmental of other people and quite kind to themselves. And maybe what you're describing is not just an Orthodox Jewish thing, and it's more just a human thing. And so maybe we're certain groups are more inclined and so more groups are more open, you know, based on culture, based on upbringing, based on being parts of certain communities. But I'm just wondering, like, because one of my goals with the podcast and Future of Jewish, our digital magazine, you know, there's many goals, but one of them is to create more opportunities for secular folks to get to know religious or Orthodox folks and vice versa. And to understand that we're actually not incredibly different. We do choose to do things differently and live our lives in different ways in many cases, but we also are humans and can actually find a lot of common ground and can actually relate to each other in ways that maybe the media or certain groups, certain channels and platforms, you know, they try to polarize us. Whereas I really want to bring us together because, you know, I had, I'm sure, you know, the former MK Dov Lipman, you know, on my podcast yesterday, and he talked about the biggest issue in Israel. He literally said the greatest threat to Israel's future is not Iran or Hezbollah or any of the other Palestinian or Islamic Muslim, you know, factions. It's Jew versus Jew. And it's how do we coexist and live together, but in a productive way, not just saying, okay, you're going to live in Bnei Brak and I'm going to live in Tel Aviv, or, you know, you're going to live in the States and you're going to live in the West Bank, but to actually have productive relationships and relations, communal and interpersonal. So I guess what I'm trying to say is, how do we do a better job of creating those two-way streets between the groups of people that maybe you run in those circles and the groups of people that I run in those circles? How do we, you know, create those better relations?
Wow, that is a really good question. You make a lot of good points over there. So first of all, I will agree with MK Lippman about that exact point. I think that the Jew versus Jew fighting and just the general, I'm not going to call it a civil war, but the fact that we're growing into multiple different communities that have very little to say to each other is a major problem. And I commend your efforts to bridge those gaps, because that's one of the most important, if not the most important thing facing the state of Israel today and the people of Israel today. I think it's so important. And frankly, and this partially gets to the answer, how I would answer that question, part of it is that I think that our labels are usually much more damaging than doing very much good. Even the label religious versus secular, you mentioned it earlier. And when you said some people they don't believe in God, they don't believe in God that much, they might have a weak relationship with God. Okay, well, let's take somebody, for example, who kind of believes in God or doesn't. So is that person religious or secular? Well, that person can define him or herself however that person wants. It's not for me to say. But on some level, does it really matter? I mean, part of it, like there are religious people who don't believe in God, and there are secular people who have very strong belief in God. And I think that this binary that we have, it's not only two different things, but binary and grouping people into he belongs here and she belongs there. And frankly, I'm as guilty as anybody. My podcast called Orthodox Conundrum, I'm talking about issues in orthodoxy. I'm doing it every single day. That's my job. And at the same time, I fully recognize that I wish we'd look at it as maybe as a continuum, or not even at all. We're just Jews. We're just the people of Israel, and we're trying to get along, and we each have our own ways. And in all ways, some of us are religious in this way, and some of us are religious in that way, and some of us aren't religious at all, and some of us are whatever we are. And I don't mean to leave out Arab Israeli citizens as well. That's a different question, how we include them in this larger fabric of the society that we're building. But right now, let's talk about Jewish Israelis, since that's our primary focus today. So I think part of the problem, and maybe part of the answer, is to try to lessen the importance and meaning of these labels. If a person is Jewish, then, whether he's Orthodox or Reform or secular or anything else is kind of a detail that really shouldn't matter so much. If that's really between that person and God, or maybe just in terms of the way society, because we have to, it's important for different things. It is important if I'm going to a synagogue to know, is this a prayer service I'm going to feel comfortable in? Because if I'm a Reformed Jew, I might not want to go to a prayer service in a place with a mechitza, with a barrier. And if I'm an Orthodox Jew, I might not feel comfortable in one that's an egalitarian service. Fine, I understand for buildings, but it's a different thing putting a label on a building than on a person. And there are places for it, but maybe one of the ideas is to try to get rid of those labels and stop giving so much meaning to those labels, because ultimately, do they really mean so much? I'm not even sure they even are so meaningful, and we attach more meaning to them than is really necessary. I think part of it also, when you mentioned earlier about being judgmental, you're right. And I think I certainly don't believe in cancel culture. And in that example I gave with Meshi Zahav, part of the question would be, okay, but he did a lot of good in his life. I said he was a hero, and those heroic things are still good. In this particular case, the reason I think it's important to mention it is because, sadly, that is a very, very key part of his legacy. And more to the point, there are victims. When there are victims involved, it's one thing if a guy does something and pays the price. Okay, something that's that. But here's somebody who literally abused people, raped people, and those people never got their day in court. Those people are carrying those scars around. And when those people see someone lauded as a hero, as one of the great men of Israel, when they know that he did something truly terrible to them, and now they're being told by somebody else, this guy was a great person, they're effectively being silenced. And those scars are therefore going to only go deeper and become more acute. So that's why I think it's important in those situations that, even though I'm not into canceling people, but when it comes to sexual abuse of the nature that Meshi Zahav did, and he gets away with it effectively, it's important minimally not to ignore it. We have to bring that out as part of the legacy. Another aspect, when you talk about bridging the gaps between religious and secular, we have to start listening to each other. We have to make sure that we understand where everyone's coming from. We have to realize that people who don't agree with us aren't evil. They just have a different opinion. And too often we look at people on the other side of the aisle, and this applies in any society, not just Israel, but other side of the aisle, not simply as people with whom we disagree. And we can say, I disagree strongly. As an Orthodox Jew, there I am using that label again, but as an Orthodox Jew, I believe that halakha, Jewish law, is binding. And if someone were to ask me, do you think, would I like it if secular Jews would start keeping halakha? Of course, I think that's wonderful. But I'm not going to impose that upon a secular Jew. I mean, that's if he wants to talk about it, for sure. But that's not my secret goal all along, that I'm going to talk to him only because secretly I'm trying to get you to keep halakha. That's disingenuous. If we could have a conversation, that's great. And if he wants to ask me why I think, or if I think you should keep halakha, I'll be honest about it. But I'm not going to do something underhanded to secretly try and infuse him with my secret Orthodox potion so that he's going to turn religious without even realizing what happened to him. I'm not into that. I think we can have an authentic conversation. You know what? If I'm not open to the fact that I can learn something from that person too, just as much as he can learn from me, then we've got a real problem. That's a way of doing it too, by opening up that dialogue. And my last point, Josh, is this, which is that, and this gets to what I was saying before, I think in order to have that dialogue and in order to open ourselves up that the other side isn't evil, we have to realize that our side isn't perfect too. And that comes down to the idea of internal criticism by saying that orthodoxy has problems, or if a secular person were to say the secular society has its problems too, by opening up to the fact that we haven't found all the answers yet either, we're allowing ourselves to say, well, if my society isn't perfect, maybe a different society might be inferior in certain ways, because there are things I like about my society that I wouldn't change, but there might be things in which they're superior. If I'm open to that, there could be a lot we can talk about.
So, I want to get into politics here, which I normally don't do on the podcast, but I think it's an interesting segue because, you were talking about how there's no hidden agenda with, how you want certain people to live or believe or what have you.
Well, in my case, I'm sure for some people there are, but
right.
I try not to live like that.
Yeah, of course. And I would say most people are probably like you, and hopefully at least like you. And let's just assume that to be the case. But we both live in the same country, right? We both live in Israel. We're both citizens of Israel, which means we both can vote. And so on one hand, what you're saying is, I'm not trying to convert you, so to speak, into living the life that I live and believing the things that I believe. But on the other hand, when I go vote, I'm probably going to vote, as I would too, like you're going to vote for the things that you think are important in society. Mm-hmm. I'm going to vote for what I think is important. And I think that's where it doesn't, on an interpersonal level, there's no real threat, so to speak. But when it comes time for elections and for deciding who's going to be, in power and how things are, what laws are going to be passed and overturned and this, that, and the other, that's where I think people feel threatened, because they say, here's a group of people on whichever side that mm-hmm. lives a completely different life and believes in things that are in many ways completely different to what I believe and how I think and how I see the world and the country that I want to live in. And I'm just curious, how you look at being an Orthodox Jew in Israeli society, not necessarily who you vote for, that's less interesting to me, but what are some of the things that you think, are just very important for Orthodox Jews in Israel? And what are also some of the things that you feel most people think about Orthodox Jews in Israeli society that maybe are not so true?
Interesting. Well, you asked me not to really talk about who I'm voting for, but so I won't do that. But I will say who I'm not voting for, because that relates to your question. And the answer is I don't vote for religious parties on principle, because that gets to the heart of what you're talking about, because I think that that's exactly the problem. When you have a religious party, especially if that religious party is dedicated towards changing the way that a secular Jew has to live. And I'm not saying they all do that, but when a religious party does that, I think that's out of bounds, because I don't think it belongs there. In fact, I believe on some level of a separation of church and state in Israel. I don't think that Israel should be a religious society, meaning, once again, let me be clear. If a secular Jew were to come to me and say, do you think I personally should keep halacha? Do you think that would be the right thing for me to do? I'd be like, yes, I do. Personally, I think that it would be great. If every Jew kept halacha, Jewish law, that would be great. I think that would be a wonderful thing. I think it would be good for Israel. But for me to try and impose that on somebody, to try and say it's mandatory, that with the arm of the law, I'm going to force you to keep Jewish law, I think that's a terrible thing to do. And yes, I know in the Bible, we do have such a thing as the arm of the religious state, so to speak. It was a different form of government. And Rav Soloveitchik, once again, talks about this. He says that commitment to Jewish law that is imposed from without cannot stand. He says that. So I can rely on Rav Soloveitchik, who knew what he was talking about a heck of a lot more than I do, to say that I think it's inappropriate. So I don't believe in imposing religious law. That does not mean that Jewish values should not inform Israeli society. Like, I think the idea that Saturday, that Shabbat is a day of rest in Israel, however that's defined, I think that's important, because that's a key part of Jewish culture. And we can argue where that line is drawn. Where does it go from a theocracy to values and culture? The fact that, for example, restaurants in Israel do not serve chametz on Pesach, I think that's a really nice thing. I think it's really important. And that'd be very different for me to go into somebody's house and say, throw out your chametz. I'm going to come in here. Come on. Okay, come on, boys. We're going to go in there. We're going to arrest this guy because he has chametz in his house. That's going too far, in my opinion. But in public buildings, having no chametz in Pesach, I think is a nice thing. And once again, where that line is drawn is an interesting question. But that's different from imposing religion on individuals when having a larger cultural and a values-based religion in Israel about certain ideas. When even ideas in the United States, they're talking about Roe v. Wade. I don't want to get into that now, but when life starts being informed by Jewish values rather than by something else, yeah, you have to choose something. So in Israel, the Jewish state, I think, Jewish values, however we define them, should be where we get those ideas from. For many ideas when it comes to civil law and in determining how the state is run. But I don't believe that the state should be run on religious grounds, because I don't think that I can impose it on people. I think that religious parties per se are actually a tremendous disservice to authentic Torah Judaism. If I say, I don't even mean it tongue in cheek, I mean it genuinely. The best way to get people to hate Torah is to vote for religious parties and give them more power. And the best way for Torah to lose any of its luster is for more seats to be given over to religious parties. So on principle, I only vote for secular parties. I don't think there's a problem having religious politicians. I think that's great. But a party dedicated to only Torah ideals, I'm against them. I know I kind of got away from your question, but I think it's an important point over there. So I think that a lot of people, I would guess that most people in the Orthodox community probably would disagree with what I just said, although there are some who agree. I'm not a unique lone voice out there. I think other people also agree that religious parties are not a good thing. And I just think that's damaging for society. I think one of the ways when you talk about voting that we can overcome some of those ideas is, if I had my ideal, if admittedly, we don't have a two-party system, but let's just imagine, for the sake of argument, there were only two parties. Let's call it in the old-fashioned Israel, Labor and Likud are the two big parties. Let's say that were the situation. And, each one has its share of religious politicians, some on the left, some on the right. And you vote for a party like that. Well, because you're not because it's not a single issue party, which is trying to impose a very specific agenda on all of Israeli society, or alternatively, trying to take its community and move it away from the rest of Israeli society and have its own rules applied to it. If it weren't working like that, that would be the best way to integrate everybody together, because you'd have religious people voting for Labor, religious people voting for Likud. You have secular people voting for Labor and secular people voting for Likud. And then the lines are not as theologically drawn, which I think is usually not healthy.
I know that this will be a difficult question to answer, but you being American and growing up in American society where there clearly is separation between church and state, and then moving to Israel, do you feel that has any view on how you look at Israeli politics, or are you simply just saying this is how I believe, irregardless of where I grew up and what I was exposed to?
I'm sure it has an influence. I don't know how it couldn't have an influence, but I don't think it has a direct influence in the sense of I came to Israel believing this, because when I first came to Israel and I first became a citizen, however many years ago, I voted for religious parties. I didn't think like this at all. I was a proud voter for religious parties. And, usually it would be something like the Mafdal, we used to call the National Religious Party, which has obviously morphed into different things since then. And, I didn't see a problem with it. It was only as time went on, I started to develop the way I think about these issues. And I realized, I don't think this is particularly healthy. So yes, I'm sure my American background has an influence on it, but because I continue to be, my family still lives in the United States, largely, like my parents, my siblings live there. So I'm still connected to America in a lot of strong ways, not to mention the fact that when I ran a yeshiva for 11 years, it was for non-Israelis. So the majority of our students were from the United States. So I'd go recruiting there and I'd be in touch with them, and still am. So because of that, I certainly I'm not going to say I had a foot in the United States, but I had a strong connection with what was going on over there. So that continued to influence me. But at the same time, my views have evolved independent of that while I've been in Israel. Probably when I was in the United States, if you had asked me at that time, who would I vote for in Israel, I would have said a religious party. And only once I'd been in Israel for a while and saw how that affects society and my reaction against what I see as a negative impact on society, I would say, ooh, that's not good. I wish in this sense we could go to a more American model in that particular area.
Can you explain to us, from the time that you got to Israel until today, what has been, of course, it's your experience and you can't speak for all Orthodox Jews in Israel, but what has been the evolution of the Orthodox Jewish experience by and large in the state of Israel?
Hard to say. Part of the problem is, Joshua, that the Orthodox Jewish experience is so variegated. Like, we've been talking about Orthodoxy now for the sake of convenience as if it's a single group, but there's so many different groups within that larger grouping. We can talk about Haredi, Hasidic, National Religious, but even within those groupings, there's so many subgroupings. And I already mentioned them, not into labels at all. But if we had to do it, there's so many different groups. Every Hasidic group has its own specific way of looking at the world. Every yeshiva of the major yeshiva within the Haredi world has its way of looking at it, its Rosh Yeshiva, its particular philosophy. And then in turn, the national religious community as well. There's what they call the people from Gush, and then they have the Kabnikim. There are different groups there as well. It's so hard to say that. So I don't know about the evolution of the Orthodox world there. I'm just not sure. I do think that in general, Israeli society feels to me like it's more polarized. I don't know, because my experience is really limited. Living in Ramat Beit Shemesh is a very specific place. I've been in Ramat Beit Shemesh itself for, I think, 22 years at this point. First, I lived in Yerushalayim, and now I live here. so my own experience is so sheltered in that sense. I'd be nervous, and I think it would be unfair for me to start describing how people outside of that feels. I will say that I probably have been affected by the fact that in Beit Shemesh, there really has been an acute sense of polarization, that the Haredi community in Ramat Beit Shemesh Aleph, where I live, in some ways, there's some wonderful, wonderful aspects of that community. There are also aspects of the community and some leaders in the community who have demonstrated sort of a takeover mentality of, oh, we want to control the whole city. We'd like it to be that we can impose our rules upon everybody. Maybe, I'm guessing about 15, 18 years ago, something like that, there was a movement in Ramat Beit Shemesh to try to they put up these signs all over the Merkaz, the area, the main shopping area in Ramat Beit Shemesh, or at that time, they put up signs saying, you can only go into the stores here if you're dressed modestly. Now, that's the kind of thing you see in Mea Shearim and Geula in very specific neighborhoods, and Ramat Beit Shemesh Bet in Beit Shemesh, but they wanted to make Ramat Beit Shemesh Aleph like that. It was a movement by several rabbis who are at the right wing of the Haredi world in Ramat Beit Shemesh doing that. And there was a very strong backlash against that because the majority of people here didn't want that. But some people try to impose it. And that's part of the problem I have, is when people try to impose their religious views upon other people. This was a case of Orthodox upon Orthodox. They weren't talking really to secular Jews. There weren't so many in Ramat Beit Shemesh. But I remember that being very, very upsetting, and people fought against it and it didn't stick. It didn't last. So I know that Ramat Beit Shemesh is a good example of some of the real problems, or it demonstrates some of the real problems of this takeover mentality that they want to say. They feel, I'm sure that community feels very much under siege, that the Western world in general is becoming more and more promiscuous in their view, is becoming more and more permissive in their view, is becoming more and more driving itself away from Torah values in their view. And because of that, we have to try and build our walls as high as possible to make sure they don't affect us. Okay, maybe it's coming from a good place, but to impose that upon other people who don't want those walls, it's a problem. So anyway, my experience has been very limited to this very specific neck of the woods. And so I've had an interesting experience here, and I love it here, but I'm not sure it's representative.
Talk to me about the settlements. I know it's a hot topic here in Israel, no matter where you come from and what you believe and don't believe and where you live. But, how do you personally see the settlements? I imagine it has to come from some kind of a religious lens, or does it not at all? How do you look at that kind of thing?
So I hope that most of what I look at comes from a religious lens, because that's how I see the world, as someone who tries to live life according to Torah values. And obviously, like everybody else, I'm sure I fail plenty of times. I know I fail plenty of times, but I try to use that as a lens in which, or through which, I see the world. So the idea of the biblical heartland of Judea and Samaria in a purely theoretical, detached from political realities right now, on a purely theoretical level, I say, yeah, that's part of Israel. That's part of the land of Israel. And in the eschatological age, the future messianic age, that's going to be part of Israel. I believe that. That's what it is. How that guides practical policy decisions on the ground today is a completely different question. And once again, you have to look at it through Torah values and through a Torah lens, because different people will say that, are we allowed to give away land? Are we required in certain situations to give away land? Because if it's going to save Jewish lives, what do we do? And I think Jewish law has to take a stand over there. And with something as large as this, which deals with the land of Israel, I think Jewish law should have a say there. I don't mean in public policy. I'm saying in terms of how I see it, if you want my personal opinion about what it looks like. Now, that having been said, there are many different opinions within Jewish law about what should be done. Obviously, we all know that there are certain people in Jewish law who say giving away even an inch of land is forbidden according to Jewish law. That's not allowed, it's prohibited. And that certainly has a very strong backing. There's strong reason to believe that. There are other people who say that should it be vital for Israel's security or to save lives to give away land, then it's permissible. My natural inclination, I'm not a scholar, I'm not going to pretend that I can judge among them and say, and opinion A, opinion B, and I say opinion B is right. I don't do that. But knowing that there are two different opinions out there, I identify more with the opinion that says that should it be feasible, and if it really would, in all likelihood, according to the best security estimates, if it actually would lead to a peaceful resolution and would save lives, I would be in favor of giving away land. Would I do it with a heavy heart? Absolutely. It would be, I think it would be very, very sad. But at the same time, and maybe even on some level unjust. From a different perspective, of course, I realize that keeping the land might be unjust to the Palestinians. I accept that. I know their narrative is not a false narrative. We have two different narratives. That's part of the problem over here. We have two completely separate narratives, and they're both fair. Neither one is wrong. We both have something to stand on. So my natural inclination is, if I really believe that we could give away land and the result would be that we could finally say, all right, the long-standing war between Israel and the Arabs is now kind of coming to a close because we've come to some sort of resolution that both sides are unhappy with but can live with. And that's kind of going to be able to stand. Then on the one hand, it would be very, very sad, but I'd be even happier about the fact that, wow, fewer people are going to die now. And we can actually see what kind of society we can make when we don't have that under siege mentality that even now, as things have certainly have gotten better with our Arab neighbors, with the Abraham Accords and so on and so forth. Obviously, we're in unprecedented times. At the same time, though, as long as the Palestinian issue remains unresolved, we can never really be relaxed. There's a lot going on. There's a lot going on. If that could finally end, then I'd be sad giving away land and thrilled at the possibility of seeing what kind of society can we really build where we can really focus on ourselves, focus on building the best state of Israel, the most values-laden, beautiful, amazing state of Israel that we possibly could. Let's try and see what Jews can do when we really can work together to build this new experiment, the first time in 2,000 years that we've had any form of independence. So it's easy for me to say, I don't live in the Shtachim, I don't live in the territory. So people who are living there can listen to this and say, it's easy for you to say, you're not giving up your house. I get that. I got it. But that's my general feeling about it. I hope that makes sense.
Yeah, it does. I want to get to your podcast. I know you have a few, but specifically Intimate Judaism kind of stands out for me just because, there's so many podcasts today. I mean, even my podcast, it's just another one of the podcasts out there. But
no way. This is a great podcast. This is not just another podcast.
But Intimate Judaism really stands out as different, and hitting maybe a sweet spot that is not being hit in other places. And I'm just curious if you could tell us a little bit more about the podcast, what inspired and motivated it, and what people can look forward to hearing in it.
Sure. So that podcast started actually as it was almost a spinoff from my other podcast, Orthodox Conundrum. I did a podcast episode with Tali Rosenbaum, who is a sex and couples therapist here in Beit Shemesh. And the podcast episode we did was maybe about 4 years ago about masturbation. Masturbation, according to Jewish law, according to our sources, is forbidden. And it's the source of tremendous amounts of anguish and guilt for many young men. And we basically talked about it from a halachic Jewish law and from a therapeutic perspective. We did it together. And that podcast really hit a nerve. A lot of people talked to me about it as, people came over to me, some teachers in various yeshivot, talking about just the importance of dealing with that topic. And because of that, my wife, Eliza, suggested that we turn that dynamic that Tali and I had in that podcast into a regular series of its own. And Tali also been thinking something similar. So ultimately that became Intimate Judaism. So Intimate Judaism became this podcast where I, as a rabbi, speak about the thoughts of Jewish law, what Jewish law says about various aspects of intimacy and sexuality, as well as, Jewish thought, how it basically Jewish thought interfaces with sexuality. And Tali's coming from a perspective, she herself is Orthodox. Her perspective on the podcast is as an Orthodox sex and couples therapist, which means that she and I are often obviously coming from broadly the same perspective, but we often disagree and we're often saying different opinions. And I think that dynamic, that paradox, that tension is actually very healthy. And it's part of what makes the podcast successful. So now we've been doing it for 4 years. We have 40 something episodes. It comes out monthly, although we have a hiatus in the summer, though we usually have one episode in the summer. We are recording one in about a week and a half, another episode to come out soon. And we're willing to talk about anything. One of the goals of the podcast ultimately is to try to have some conversations that otherwise are not being had in the Orthodox community. I'm sure they're taking place in some context, but in a general public way, I'm not going to say it's a taboo, but there's a reluctance to speak about a lot of these issues. There are even halachic Jewish law reasons why perhaps one shouldn't speak about them publicly. Before I started this podcast, I actually consulted with a couple of rabbinic mentors of my own to make sure that they felt that it was appropriate. And so that's why I moved forward once I received their blessing. And in so doing, I think that I just see from the emails that we get, we have a lot of listeners inside the Orthodox community and in different segments of the Orthodox community, left, right, and center, as well as people outside the Orthodox community. And I'm really proud of the podcast. I think Tali does a fantastic job as my co-host. We just our dynamic is good and strong. She is someone from whom I've learned so much. I'm sure I've learned more from her than she's learned from me. Her husband's a rabbi, so probably most of what I say she's already heard. But when she talks about the therapeutic perspective, it's all new for me, and I'm really just I'm always astounded at her breadth of knowledge and the depth of knowledge there. So I really enjoy talking to her, and I think that our conversations come out and really provide a perspective for people who otherwise haven't thought about these issues. That just it's I think it's been helpful. I'd say very often people too often in the Orthodox world carry with them an attitude of, well, if you have to ask, it's probably forbidden. And that's really not a healthy or accurate attitude. And we've been able, I think, in some level to at least, if nothing else, open people's eyes to the fact it's more complicated than you think in a good way, that things that you assumed, well, of course you can't do that. You know, people question what halakha, Jewish law, allows, for example, between a husband and a wife in the bedroom. You know, is it limited what you can do, or you're not limited? Well, there are a range of opinions. We talk about them. We say, what can you do? And while the podcast isn't there to give a final decision on Jewish law, at the same time, we present the options and open the conversation and say, this is something which you may not have thought about before. And yeah, I'm proud of it. Thank you for asking about it. It's a really nice podcast.
I just feel that what you're talking about with the nuances and the complications, the complexities involved in that topic is really just a microcosm for life, right? And for
sure.
Judaism and Jewish peoplehood and Jewish history, Israel. We talked about the settlements. I mean, and to me, we just try to simplify everything instead of really taking the time and energy to understand the complexities and the nuances and the complications. And I think when we do, we become more humbled, but we also become more enlightened by the vastness of the world as it has been and what it is today.
I think it's empowering. I completely agree with you. I think it's empowering to realize that it's not so simple, that there are many different ways of looking at an issue, and we don't have to become so restricted in our viewpoint to say there's only one way of seeing something. On the whole, there are many ways of seeing most things. And by opening ourselves up to that, we become empowered. We allow ourselves to be curious. We allow ourselves to live with paradox. We allow ourselves to say, you know what, I don't have all the answers, and that's okay. Not having all the answers is a sign of intellectual depth, not of being unsure of yourself. You can say, I really believe what I believe, and at the same time, I don't pretend that I have every single answer. Just Joshua's an example. I really try to be someone who really believes in God. I have a really relationship with God. I'm really happy with my relationship with God. That doesn't mean that I now am some sort of theocrat who has all the answers for everybody out there. I can only give people my own experience, my own lived experience, and try to transmit that to people and say, and if this is beneficial to you, that's great. And if it's not, then, talk to somebody else. Maybe that other person will have a better approach. And I like the idea that we can live with paradox. We can live with dichotomy. We can live with the fact that we each can believe what we believe, but be open to the fact that we don't have all the answers all the time.
Scott, this has been really a fun and enlightening episode. Thank you so much for your time.
I had a nice time. Thank you very much.